The world's most powerful leaders just told Donald Trump to his face that enough is enough. In a sequence of events that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago, heads of state from Europe, Canada, and beyond have stopped appeasing the American president and started pushing back with an intensity that has startled even veteran diplomats. This is not a gradual shift. This is not a temporary blip. This is a fundamental restructuring of how the world's democracies relate to the United States, and it is happening right now in real time, with consequences that will echo for decades. If you want to understand what is actually unfolding in global politics and why it matters to you, this is the breakdown you need. Let us start with the moment that crystallized everything. At the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025, Trump delivered what multiple foreign officials have described as the most jarring American presidential address they have ever witnessed. He told assembled world leaders that their countries were, quote, going to hell. He rambled. He contradicted himself. He asserted things that are simply not true. And when it was over, the response from the international community was not deference, was not accommodation, was not the nervous compliance that Trump seems to expect from everyone around him. Instead, there was something closer to collective exhaustion and increasingly open resistance. One senior European official told reporters that the speech confirmed what many had suspected, that Trump operates on vibes rather than facts, and that dealing with this administration requires a fundamentally different approach than anything Washington has demanded before. That different approach is now taking shape across multiple capitals simultaneously. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz flew to the White House and did something that his two immediate predecessors, Olaf Scholz and Angela Merkel, never managed. He established a personal rapport with Trump. He spoke the language of business, of mutual benefit, of transactional value. He made the case, repeatedly and directly, that Europe and America should work together to pressure Russia, not Ukraine. He walked away with something approaching a working relationship. But here is what that outcome reveals. Europe has fundamentally recalibrated its strategy. The old approach of treating the transatlantic alliance as a given, as a permanent feature of the landscape that requires only maintenance, has been abandoned. In its place is something far more calculated, more strategic, and frankly, more desperate. European leaders are now treating every interaction with Washington as a negotiation where they need to deliver something concrete, something that Trump can use as a win, something that prevents him from drifting toward whoever called him most recently with a more appealing offer. If you are finding this analysis useful, make sure you subscribe to this channel because we are going to keep tracking these developments as they unfold. The story is moving fast, and there is a lot more to understand about what is happening and why. The G7 summit that followed only deepened the sense of fracture. Canada hosted leaders from the world's 7 largest advanced economies, and the communiqué that emerged was telling not for what it said, but for what it could not say. The United States blocked language that would explicitly name Russia as the aggressor in its war against Ukraine. This is not a minor procedural dispute. For decades, G7 statements have served as a mechanism for the United States and its allies to present a unified front on fundamental questions of international order. When Washington refuses to acknowledge the most significant act of aggression in Europe since World War II, the signal that sends to Moscow, to Beijing, and to every country watching global politics is profound. Russia hears that the American president does not see the invasion as a problem, requiring a clear moral and political response. China hears that the transatlantic alliance is weaker than it has been in living memory. Every smaller nation that has relied on the implicit guarantee that major democracies will stand together against aggression hears that guarantee is no longer reliable. The Europeans have noticed. A Chatham House analysis following the G7 summit laid out the situation with unusual candor. The United States under Donald Trump no longer wishes to work with its allies on many of the world's most pressing problems. That is not partisan spin. That is the assessment of one of Europe's most prestigious foreign policy institutes. And the response from European capitals has been to begin preparing for a world in which American reliability cannot be assumed. That preparation shows up in 3 distinct areas, and each one matters. The first is defense spending. NATO's new target is 5% of gross domestic product devoted to defense, up from the 2% that was already struggling to be met. Germany, historically reluctant to exceed 1%, has now constitutional amendments in place that allow unlimited debt-financed defense spending. This is a revolution in German fiscal policy, a country that has treated military expenditure as almost morally suspect since the aftermath of World War II. It is happening because Berlin understands that if American security guarantees become conditional, Europe needs the capacity to provide its own deterrent. France, the United Kingdom, and Poland are moving in parallel directions. The European Union is racing to develop independent military procurement, independent command structures, independent intelligence capabilities. This is not theoretical planning. This is happening now. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something that matters for understanding this moment. When you see world leaders changing their defense policies, increasing military budgets, building independent capabilities, what do you think that tells us about what they believe is coming? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question that determines whether we are paying attention to the right things. The second area of European preparation is sanctions enforcement. Here is a fact that deserves more attention than it gets. According to internal European Union reports, approximately 80% of Russian sanctions evasion flows through China. Russia is able to sustain its military operations in Ukraine, reconstitute its forces faster than most analysts expected, and continue the war precisely because sanctions designed to strangle its economy are being circumvented through a network centered on Beijing. Before Trump's return to office, the United States and Europe cooperated closely on tracking and disrupting these sanctions evasion networks. That cooperation has essentially stopped. The Americans are no longer at the table in any meaningful way. Europe is left to enforce sanctions alone, which means the pressure on Russia is significantly reduced, which means the war continues longer than it otherwise would, which means more suffering, more destruction, more displacement. The connection between Trump's transactional approach to alliances and the actual human consequences in Ukraine is direct and measurable. The third area is trade diversification. European countries are now actively seeking alternative economic partnerships, alternative supply chains, alternative markets that do not depend on American goodwill. This does not mean Europe is abandoning the United States. It means Europe is preparing for a scenario in which American policy could become actively harmful to European interests. When your main trading partner starts using tariffs as a diplomatic hammer, when they threaten your economy to extract concessions on unrelated issues, when they treat decades-long economic relationships as leverage to be exercised, you start making plans that do not include them. This is rational behavior by sovereign nations protecting their own interests. It is also, from the perspective of American influence, a disaster in slow motion. The Brookings Institution has analyzed this dynamic with particular clarity. Scholars there describe Trump's foreign policy as an accelerant rather than an architect. He is accelerating the transition away from a United States-led international order, but he lacks the vision, discipline, or leadership to bring countries together around a plan for what comes next. That is a devastating assessment from one of Washington's most respected think tanks. The post-World War II international order was built on the premise that American power would serve as a public good, that alliances were real commitments rather than negotiating positions, that rules mattered and would be enforced. Trump rejects all of that. He sees international order as a cloud castle abstraction. He treats trade and tariffs and market leverage as central instruments of national security. He redefines what counts as security in ways that strip out the moral and institutional architecture that made previous arrangements sustainable. And he does all of this without proposing anything to replace what he is dismantling. If you are just joining us, make sure to hit that share button. This is the kind of information that more people need to understand, and you can help spread it by making sure your network sees this analysis. The Time magazine analysis of Trump's first year in his second term coined a phrase that has started appearing in diplomatic circles: the Donroe Doctrine. The reference is to Venezuela, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio's aggressive posture toward opposition leader Maria Machado led to a bizarre episode involving a Nobel Peace Prize social media post, a subsequent denial, and a complete diplomatic meltdown. But the broader meaning is about how the administration approaches relationships with smaller countries and even traditional allies. It is not about shared values, democratic solidarity, or long-term strategic partnerships. It is about extracting concessions, maximizing American economic benefit, and using American leverage to get what Washington wants in the immediate term. This approach may produce short-term wins for Trump, It may generate headlines about deals negotiated and concessions extracted. But the cumulative effect is a systematic erosion of the trust that made American influence possible in the first place. Here is the critical point that often gets lost in discussions of Trump's foreign policy. American power in the world was never just about military strength or economic size. It was about reliability. Other countries could count on the United States to show up, to keep its commitments, to act in predictable ways even when administrations changed. That reliability was the foundation of the dollar's reserve currency status, of the NATO alliance's deterrent credibility, of the entire network of institutions and agreements that made up the international order. When that reliability disappears, when allies can no longer count on American commitments, the foundation cracks in ways that cannot be repaired by a few flashy summits or a couple of favorable trade deals. Trust once lost is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. European officials have described their response to Trump's behavior in remarkably similar terms across multiple countries. They talk about incredulity, about a sense that the leader of a country that has been Europe's closest ally for decades has launched broadside attacks that seem designed to humiliate rather than to advance any coherent policy goal. They talk about the emotional intensity of the reaction, which is striking because European diplomats are trained to be reserved, to maintain composure, to speak in carefully calibrated language. When seasoned officials start using words like incredulous and extremely emotional in describing how their governments view American policy, something fundamental has shifted. The Council on Foreign Relations has laid out the specific areas of conflict between the Trump administration and European governments. There are three main flashpoints that are driving the deterioration of the relationship. First, tariffs and the trade war. Trump has imposed sweeping tariffs not just on China but on the European Union, on Canada, on Mexico, on Vietnam, on countries that have historically been treated as partners rather than adversaries. The trade deficit has become a central metric in his foreign policy, which means that countries like Germany with significant trade surpluses with the United States are automatic targets. Second, the Ukraine-Russia question. Trump positions himself as a neutral mediator between Ukraine and Russia, which means he does not see the United States as aligned with Ukraine against Russian aggression. That positioning directly contradicts the European view, which holds that Russia is the aggressor and Europe is on Ukraine's side. Third, burden sharing. Trump demands that European NATO members spend 5% of their gross domestic product on defense, a target that even Germany with its constitutional changes will struggle to meet quickly. The demand itself is not unreasonable. The framing, the pressure, the implied threat that American security guarantees disappear if the target is not met, all of that creates a different dynamic than the gradual cooperative increase in defense spending that was the previous model. The strategic response from Europe has been to try to keep Trump focused on Russia as the problem, to counter the narratives that Putin has been selling in his frequent calls with the American president. Putin is good at this. He tells Trump that Russia is an essential partner for dealing with Iran, for managing other global problems, for creating the appearance of American diplomatic success. That broadens the agenda in ways that make it easier for Russia to evade the hard questions about Ukraine. European leaders are now competing with Putin for Trump's attention, trying to be the last call he takes before any major decision, trying to frame everything in terms that will resonate with his transactional instincts. It is a strange and destabilizing way to conduct international relations, but it is the reality that European capitals have had to accept. I want to pause here and ask you to think about something important. We are watching a fundamental transformation in the international order, and most people are not paying attention because it is happening through diplomatic cables and communiques and backroom negotiations, rather than through dramatic military confrontations or visible crises. But the changes being made now, the strategic recalculations being undertaken by governments around the world, will determine what the world looks like for the next generation. These are not abstract policy debates. These are decisions being made in real time that will affect your security, your economy, and your future in ways that are hard to overstate. That is why this channel exists, to help you understand what is actually happening and why it matters. If that is valuable to you, hit the like button. It helps more people find this content and join the conversation about what is really going on in the world. Now let us talk about what comes next. The projections from Brookings, from the Council on Foreign Relations, from multiple independent analysts converge on a few key conclusions. First, Trump's approach is accelerating fragmentation of the international order rather than consolidating American leadership. The post-war system is not being replaced with something new and coherent. It is simply fraying, losing coherence, losing predictability, losing the institutional architecture that allowed countries to manage their differences without descending into conflict. Second, middle powers and autocracies are finding common ground in shared grievances against the status quo, which was always dominated by American values and American interests, even when it presented itself as universal. That coalition, if it solidifies, will have a very different vision of how international relations should work, one based on power and proximity and bilateral deals rather than rules and institutions and collective action. Third, the erosion of American credibility is creating space for other powers to step in, not because they offer a better model, but because they offer a different model, one that does not require accepting American leadership as the price of participation. The human impact of these shifts deserves careful attention. For people in Ukraine, the reduction in Allied pressure on Russia means a longer war, more casualties, more reconstruction needed, more lives interrupted or destroyed. For people in Europe, the increase in defense spending means resources being diverted from social programs, from healthcare, from education, from the quality of life improvements that have defined the post-war era in Western democracies. For people everywhere who have relied on the stability that American alliances provided, the uncertainty about whether those alliances will hold means having to plan for scenarios that seemed impossible a decade ago. These are not abstract policy consequences. These are the actual lived experiences of millions of people whose lives are being shaped by decisions made in capitals they may never visit. The counterpoint that needs to be addressed honestly is that Trump's supporters argue this approach is correcting long-standing imbalances, that allies have taken American generosity for granted, that the previous arrangements were not sustainable and needed to be restructured. There's a real debate to be had about burden sharing within alliances, about whether European defense spending was adequate, about whether international institutions were functioning effectively. But the debate that Trump is having is not a rigorous policy discussion about these genuine issues. It is a performance, a series of demands for immediate concessions, a willingness to threaten relationships that took decades to build in order to extract short-term concessions. The Europeans have not been perfect partners. The previous American administrations also made mistakes. But the response to imperfect arrangements is not to burn them down without anything to replace them. The response is to negotiate, to reform, to adjust. Trump has chosen destruction over renovation, and the consequences of that choice are now becoming visible across every continent. If you are finding this analysis valuable, make sure you stick around because there is a lot more to cover. We are going to continue tracking these developments and breaking down what they mean for the future of international relations. The fundamental question that this moment raises is whether the post-war international order can survive the stress being applied to it. The optimistic view, held by some analysts, is that institutions are more resilient than they appear, that allies will adapt, that the structural incentives for cooperation remain powerful even when political leadership becomes unpredictable. The pessimistic view, which seems increasingly validated by events, is that the order was never as solid as it appeared, that it depended heavily on American willingness to bear the costs of leadership, and that when that willingness disappears, the entire architecture becomes unstable. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some parts of the international order will survive and adapt. Some parts will be replaced by different arrangements, possibly worse, possibly better, depending on who fills the space. The outcome is not determined. It is being shaped by decisions being made right now by leaders in Washington and Berlin and Beijing and 100 other capitals, all of whom are responding to the same shifting landscape in different ways. What we can say with confidence is that the world as it existed when Trump took office is gone. The question is not whether there will be a new international order. The question is what that order will look like, who will shape it, and whether the transition will be managed in a way that prevents the worst outcomes, or whether it will be chaotic and destabilizing, with all the human suffering that implies. That is the stakes. That is why this matters. And that is why understanding what is actually happening, beyond the headlines and the sound bites, is more important than ever. If you have made it this far, I want to thank you for paying attention. This is not easy content to engage with. It requires thinking about complex systems, long-time horizons, and consequences that are difficult to see in the immediate moment. But this is the kind of understanding that allows us to make better choices, to participate more effectively in democratic processes, to hold our own leaders accountable for the decisions they make on our behalf. That is what informed citizenship looks like in practice. Stay engaged, keep thinking, and keep coming back for more analysis of the forces shaping our world. The story is not over. In many ways, it is just beginning.